Hey everyone, Mike here. Just want to let you know that the stream that you're about to watch was recorded via the DevOps Lounge. Head on over to chat.learndevops.com.au. You'll be forward to Discord. I really hope that we get to connect soon. Enjoy the stream. So, the role or the company culture was the question that came up on Reddit, and I thought that this was a really, really interesting question. So the person, the original poster, who, as I said, has deleted the post, so I can't show you it, essentially said, do I go for the role and just focus on the role and ignore the culture and the company? Or do I go for the company's culture? So when I'm looking for roles, when I'm looking for jobs, do I go purely for culture and ignore the role and just accept any role at a good culture? Or do I go for a good role and ignore the culture? And I think that it's a good question, because can you really have 100% of both? So can you find a really good role and a really good culture? I think that you can. I think that that is possible, but I would say that it's much more difficult to find because you're looking for an organization. I mean, first of all, I guess you've got to define what a good role is to you, and you've got to define what a good culture is to you. If a good culture is, lots of time off, very flexible, good leadership, very healthy work-life balance, good benefits, nice office in a good location with good work from home, remote possibilities, a company car, a company private jet that you get to use free willy-nilly, then of course the culture is going to be great, right? But then if the role is, I don't know, going around washing everyone's feet underneath their desk, then it may not be the right for you. But it's up to you to define what a good role is to you and what a good culture is to you. So for me personally, I'll look at it from my perspective. A good role should have interesting technologies and interesting problems. And a good culture should be one that's willing to push boundaries, willing to accept when things that have been done in the past are now starting to show their age and they need to be sort of reworked and refined to take on a more modern approach. Good management, good leadership, and a sort of healthy work-life balance with no expectations of working ridiculous hours, doing on-call and stuff like that. Now, as a contractor, I sort of generally get a lot more of what I want, because I go in there with a very clear expectation that this is what I do for this amount of time, for this amount of money on a daily basis. And so the company doesn't really dare go outside of those hours. So the work-life balance for me is always there. Finding companies that are willing to be flexible and look at new technologies and so on and so forth isn't actually that difficult, I find, in Brisbane and maybe in Australia, generally speaking, simply because as a culture here, Australia, especially maybe Queensland and Brisbane, I think Australia, maybe generally speaking, has a very highly educated population. And so most of these people that I work with have been to university, or they're very generally naturally quite smart people. And so they understand that times change, technologies move on, things get deprecated. And so I find that most companies here are willing to accept that Terraform is sort of how you do infrastructure now. Infrastructure as code is the correct way of doing it. And so we want to look at doing it. However, we've got this big pile of old stuff here that we've got to very carefully move over. But they're at least, as a culture, accepting that they do need to go from this big pile of poop that they have over here, and they need to produce something far, far nicer. Otherwise, they're going to find it very difficult to not only hire people in the future, but also manage that technology going forward. As for the role itself, do I find it hard to find roles that explore new technologies? Not really. I do tend to take roles that usually have a lot of legacy stuff involved in them, so they're not necessarily always bleeding edge. So they're not always like serverless, Kubernetes, Terraform, and all this kind of stuff. I do tend to, like my current role, for example, they're looking at using OpenShift on top of AWS, and they want that to be the Kubernetes solution. Not entirely sure why EKS isn't a thing. I'm not entirely sure. It might be something to do with the fact they've got a lot of on-prem as well, and they're migrating. Then some of that isn't being migrated into the cloud, and so maybe they just want to sort of create this ambiguous blob of compute that just spans across boundaries. So the role that I'm currently in is about uplifting and shifting technologies from a very old state and modernizing them, as well as practices, helping them with their automation, stuff like that. So for me, that role is very interesting because it's about automation. It's about improving processes, making people's lives easier. So for me, that's a really interesting role. And the culture is one of a great flexibility. So they had no issues with me at all doing a Wednesday stream, for example, with you guys coming on, going off the clock for 2 hours so I can do an hour stream with you guys on a Wednesday. They had that was just like, yeah, sure, no problem whatsoever. They do a 1 day per week or maybe 1 day every 2 weeks where we go into the office, into the central office. And they just kind of said, if you can make it, you can make it. If not, that's okay. That's sort of like a good attitude to have. It's like, if I have to work from home for a reason, then I have to work from home, and it's not challenge, it's not a problem, and so on and so forth. So I found a role that's interesting and a culture that I knew going in was highly recommended and was a good culture to go into. So I would actually say that you need to define what a good role looks like to you, a good culture looks like to you, and then try and find a company that sort of gives you both these things. But what I would say is almost like a bit of a warning. I would say that things change, times change, companies change, people change. You may go into a culture that's great today and the role is great today, but I want to speak to two things there actually. So the role is great today because the technology is great today. But the thing is most businesses don't want to be constantly changing technologies all the time. Once they've solved the problem and then they're building on that problem, they don't want to replace Ruby Rails with Python Django a year down the line. That's a huge rewrite. They don't want to then take that and build it into microservices based on Go. They then don't want to take that and build it into something else and something else a year later. Most businesses don't want to do that. So if the role is great today because the tech is great today, give it a year or two down the line and your job is going to be to maintain that tech, and very unlikely that you're going to be modernizing going forward. So you've got to think long term with these kind of roles. As for the culture, if the culture is great today, awesome. Congratulations, you found a great company to work for. Problem is that times change, and although executives do tend to stick around for a long time, if you were hired under a particular executive who works in a particular way that created that culture, and you're replaced by an executive who thinks very differently to that executive than the previous executive, I should say, then the culture can change. I do remember reading an article a while back, and I think it was called it was something like "Don't take away my fizzy drinks" or "Don't take away my soda," and it was about an engineering firm, software engineering firm in New York, I believe it was, who had a really nice culture. And after a short while, after a few years, a new CFO came in, and the first thing that the CFO observed was, what's this $30,000 per year sort of line item here? And someone explained that it was essentially the fizzy drinks, the cereal, the free food that the engineering teams consumed. It was about $30,000 a year. It's a very large company. We're not talking like 5 people in a room here. If 5 people in one room could get through $30,000 worth of cereal in a year, I'd be very impressed. I'd also be extremely worried for their health. But the CFO wanted to make an impact, right? First 90 days, how do I make this impact? Completely scrap that entirely. Then went to the board of directors and go, look how good I am. I've just saved the company $30,000 per year straight off the bat. I think, if I remember the article rightly, something like 40% of the engineering team handed in their notice on the spot, because those engineers that handed in their notice pretty much on the spot were mature, experienced engineers that had been in the market for a while. They knew that meant a severe cultural shift. And so half the team basically left. And that $30,000 line item, all of a sudden, that wasn't really $30,000 line item wasn't really that big of a line item versus the now amount of money it costs to hire to replace those people. So there's a very bad move there from management, but it meant a shift in culture. So consider what a good role means to you, consider what a good culture means to you, and ask lots of questions during the interview and express what you want. This is what a good role looks like to me. This is what a great culture looks like to me. This is something you can afford. Is this something that you can offer? Speak to the company, ask lots of questions. I've been in interviews where it's been like 15, 20 minutes because the staff have just opened up straight away and said, this is a really great place to work. I love it here. I've done a little bit of research on LinkedIn prior and been told this is really great. And so I've gone in and the interviews last 20 minutes. But if you're given an interview for an hour and they're like, it's over in like 15, 20, and they say, got any questions? Use that 40 minutes. Start asking questions. What's your tech stack? What's my laptop going to be? Am I going to get a Mac? I don't like Mac. I like working on Windows. Or I'd like working on Mac. Why are you giving me a Windows laptop? Do you use virtual desktops? Or do I have to RDP into a system and develop from that system? It's going to be sluggish and slow. There's a lot of latency there. I have to do that right now for my current engagement. And it's workable, but it is slow. And it can be a little frustrating. just for the record, I would have still taken the role, but that was something that I should have asked during the interview that I didn't, but I sort of knew ahead of time. Use that time to ask questions. What's the culture like? What are the people like? What are the holidays like? How often am I going to be doing on-call? How often are you going to ask me to work on weekends? Use the interview to find out whether it is the right role and culture for you based on you predetermining ahead of time what a good role and a good culture looks like for you. But also just remember that when you go into a job, those things may change. Very nice.